Good day to you. This is Living with Art by Mark Getlein, 11th edition. I'm just reading it aloud so that if you need to listen to it in your car on the way to work or when you're doing other things so that you can prepare for the class, you can. I mispronounce a lot of words. I apologize for that in advance. Doing the best that I can to read it and make it available to you. Living with Art, Chapter 7, Painting. To the Muslim ruler Akbar, writing in the 16th century, it seemed that painters had a unique appreciation of the divine, for in sketching anything that has life, a painter must come to feel that he cannot bestow individuality upon his work, and is thus forced to think of God, the giver of life, and will thus increase his knowledge. In the opinion of Zhang Yanyuan, a Chinese painter and scholar who lived some 7 centuries earlier, painting existed to enlighten ethics, improve human relationships, divine the changes of nature, and explore hidden truths. Leonardo da Vinci proudly claimed that painting embraces and contains within itself all things produced by nature, and for the 17th century Spanish playwright Pedro Calderón de la Barca, painting was the sum of all arts, the principal art which encompassed all the others. Clearly, painting has inspired extravagant admiration in cultures where it is practiced. Even today, if you ask 10 people to envision a work of art, 9 of them are likely to imagine a painting. But what is a painting exactly? What is it made of, and how? This chapter examines some of the standard media and techniques that painters have used across the centuries. We begin with some basic concepts and vocabulary. Paint is made of pigment, powdered color, compounded with medium or vehicle, a liquid that holds the particles of pigment together without dissolving them. The vehicle generally acts as or includes a binder as an ingredient that ensures that the paint, even when diluted, is spread thinly will adhere to the surface. Without a binder, pigments would simply powder off as the paint dried. Artist paints are generally made to a paste-like consistency and need to be diluted to be brushed freely. Aqueous media can be diluted with water. Watercolors are an example of an aqueous medium. Non-aqueous media require some other diluent. Oil paints are an example of non-aqueous medium. These can be diluted with turpentine or mineral spirits. Paints are applied to a support, which is the canvas, paper, wood, panel, wall, or other surface on which the artist works. The support may be prepared to receive paint with a ground or primer, a preliminary coating. Some pigments and binders have been known since ancient times. Others have been developed only recently. 2 techniques perfected in the ancient world that are still in use today are Encaustic and Fresco, and we begin our discussion with them. Encaustic. Encaustic paints consist of pigment mixed with wax and resin. When the colors are heated, the wax melts and the paint can be brushed easily. When the wax cools, the paint hardens. After the painting is completed, there may be a final burning in as a heat source is passed close to the surface of the painting to fuse the colors. Literary sources tell us that encaustic was an important technique in ancient Greece. The word encaustic comes from the Greek for burning in. The earliest encaustic paintings have survived, however, are funeral portraits created during the first centuries of our era in Egypt, which was then under Roman rule. Portraits such as this were set into the casings of mummified bodies to identify and memorialize the dead. The colors of this painting, almost as fresh as the day they were set down, testify to the permanence of encaustic. The technique of encaustic was forgotten within a few centuries after the fall of the Roman Empire, but it was redeveloped during the 19th century, partly in response to the discovery of the Roman Egyptian portraits. One of the foremost contemporary artists to experiment with encaustic is Jasper Johns. Numbers in Color is painted in encaustic covered over a collage of paper on canvas. Encaustic allowed Johns to build up a richly textured paint surface. Think of candle drippings and you will get the idea. Moreover, wax will not harm the paper over time as oil paint would. Fresco. With fresco, pigments are mixed with water and applied to a plaster support, usually a wall or a ceiling coated in plaster. The plaster may be dry, in which case the technique is known as fresco secco, Italian for dry fresco, but most often when speaking about fresco we mean buon fresco, true fresco, in which paint made simply of pigment and water is applied to wet lime plaster. As the plaster dries, the lime undergoes a chemical transformation and acts as a binder, fusing the pigment with the plaster surface. Fresco is above all a wall painting technique, and it has been used for large-scale murals since ancient times. Probably no other painting medium requires such careful planning and such hard physical labor. The plaster can be painted only when it has a proper degree of dampness. Therefore, the artist must plan each day's work and spread plaster only in the area that can be painted in one session. Michelangelo could cover about 1 square yard of wall or ceiling in a day. Work may be guided by a full-size drawing of the entire project called a cartoon. Once the cartoon is finalized, its contour lines are perforated with pinprick-sized holes. The drawing is transferred to the prepared surface by placing a portion of the cartoon over the damp plaster and rubbing pigment through the holes. The cartoon is then removed, leaving dotted lines on the plaster surface. With a brush dipped in paint, the artist connects the dots to recreate the drawing. Then the work of painting begins. There is nothing tentative about fresco. Whereas in some media, the artist can experiment, try out forms, and then paint over them to make corrections. Every touch of the brush in fresco is a commitment. The only way an artist can correct mistakes or change the forms is to let the plaster dry, chip it away, and start all over again. Frescoes have survived to present day from the civilization of the ancient Mediterranean, from China and India, and from the early civilizations of Mexico. Among the works we consider the greatest of all Western art are the magnificent frescoes of the Italian Renaissance. While Michelangelo was at work on the frescoes of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, Pope Julius II asked Raphael to decorate the walls of several rooms in the Vatican Palace. Raphael's fresco for the end wall of the Stanza della Signatura, a room that may have been the Pope's library, is considered by many to be the summation of Renaissance art. It is called the School of Athens, and depicts the Greek philosopher Plato and Aristotle, centered in the composition and framed by the arch along with their followers and students. The school in question means the two schools of philosophy represented by the two classical thinkers, Plato and the more abstract and metaphysical, Aristotle the more earthly and physical. Everything about Raphael's composition celebrates the Renaissance ideals of perfection, beauty, naturalistic representation, and notable principles. The towering architectural setting is drawn in linear perspective, with the vanishing point falling between the two central figures. The figures, perhaps influenced by Michelangelo's figures on the Sistine ceiling, are idealized, more perfect than life, full-bodied and dynamic. The School of Athens reflects Raphael's vision of one golden age, the Renaissance, and connects it with the golden age of Greece 2,000 years earlier. The most celebrated frescoes of the 20th century were created in Mexico, where the revolutionary government that came into power in 1921 after a decade of civil war commissioned artists to create murals about Mexico itself, the glories of its ancient civilization, its political struggles, its people, and its hopes for the future. Mixtec culture is one of a series of frescoes painted by Diego Rivera in the National Palace in Mexico City. Mixtec peoples still live in Mexico, as do descendants of all the early civilizations of the region. The Mixtec kingdoms were known for their arts, and Rivera has portrayed a peaceful community of artists at work. To the left, two men, probably nobles, are being fitted with the elaborate ritual headdress, masks, and capes that were a prominent part of many ancient Mexican cultures. To the right, smiths are melting and casting gold, and in the foreground are potters, sculptors, feather workers, mask makers, and scribes. In the background, people pan for gold in the streams. Tempera. Tempera shares qualities with both watercolor and oil paint. Like watercolor, tempera is an aqueous medium. Like oil paint, it dries to a tough and soluble film. Yet whereas oil paint tends to yellow and darken with age, tempera colors retain their brilliance and clarity for centuries. Technically, tempera is paint in which the vehicle is an emulsion, which is a stable mixture of an aqueous liquid with an oil, fat, wax, or resin. A familiar example of an emulsion is milk, which consists of a minute droplets of fat suspended in liquid. A derivative of milk called casein is one of the many vehicles that can be used to make tempera colors. The most famous tempera vehicle, however, is another naturally occurring emulsion, egg yolk. Tempera dries very quickly, and so colors cannot be blended easily once they are set down. Although tempera can be diluted with water and applied in a broad wash, painters who use it most commonly build up forms gradually with fine hatching and cross-hatching brushstrokes, much like a drawing. Traditionally, tempera was used on a wood panel support prepared with a ground of gesso, a mixture of white pigment and glue that sealed the wood and could be sanded and rubbed to a smooth ivory-like finish. A lovely example of tempera painting as it was practiced during the early Renaissance is St. Anthony Abbot, tempted by a heap of gold. One of the 8 panels illustrated episodes from the life of St. Anthony, and it was painted by a 15th century Sienese artist we know as the master of the Osservanza. Anthony Abbot lived in Egypt, dying there in 356 CE. A popular account of his life written soon after inspired numerous paintings over the centuries. This panel depicts Anthony setting out from a salmon-colored church along a stony path into the desert wilderness, where the devil will put many temptations in his way. One temptation was a heap of gold, originally depicted at the lower left. Anthony recoils at the sight of it, his hands raised in surprise. The Osservanza master has built up the forms of his work slowly and patiently through layers of small, precise brushstrokes. Particularly charming are the barren hills and scraggly trees of the landscape. The painter's attempt to imagine what a desert must look like. Workshop apprentices would have made the Osservanza master's colors fresh daily, grinding the pigments with water to form a paste, and then mixing the paste with diluted egg yolk. They would have made just enough for one day's work, since tempera colors do not keep. Not long after the Osservanza's master's time, tempera fell out of favor in Europe. The technique was forgotten until the 19th century, when it was revived based on descriptions in an early Renaissance artist's handbook. Today, tempera is available commercially in tubes, though many painters still prefer to make their own. One modern painter who experimented with both commercial and handmade tempera was Jacob Lawrence. Like Observanza master, Lawrence used tempera to make a series of images that tell a story. In this case, the story of the Great Migration, the migration of thousands of African Americans from the South to the North beginning about 1910. Lawrence has said that he was drawn to the raw, sharp, rough effect of tempera colors, qualities he brings out quite well in his scrappy handling here. With paint applied sparingly to simplified forms. Oil. Oil paints consist of pigment compounded with oil. Historically, the most commonly used oils have been linseed oil, poppy seed oil, and walnut oil. Today, commercial manufacturers of artist colors often grind darker pigments with linseed oil and light pigments such as white and yellow with poppy seed oil or safflower oil, which do not yellow over time, as linseed oil tends to do so. What all these oils have in common is that they will dry at room temperature, leaving the pigment particles suspended in a transparent film. Oil was known as a medium in Western Europe as early as 12th century, but it did not begin to rise to popularity until 2 centuries later. By the 15th century, oil paint had eclipsed tempera as the medium of choice in Northern Europe. It would soon conquer Southern Europe as well. From that time and for about 500 years, the word painting in Western culture was virtually synonymous with oil painting. Only since the 1950s, with the introduction of acrylics, discussed later in this chapter, has the supremacy of oil been challenged. A beautiful example of oil painting from the first decades of popularity is a goldsmith in his shop by Petrus Christus. The scene is set in the prosperous Netherlandish city of Bruges, where Christus spent his career. A richly dressed young couple is paying a visit to the local goldsmith. Soon to be married, her betrothal girdle is displayed on the counter. They have come to purchase a ring. The seated goldsmith holds a jeweler's balance with a ring in one tray and a weight in the other. Gold coins and additional weights are stacked on the counter. A convex mirror reflects the streetscape outside and two passerby, one of whom carries a falcon perched on his gloved hand. To the right, a green curtain has been drawn back to reveal a fascinating display of the goldsmith's raw materials: coral, crystal, porphyry, seed pearls, and beads. Finished products are displayed as well: rings, brooches, a gold-lidded crystal container, and polished pewter vessels with gold fittings. When oil paints were first introduced, most artists, including Petrus Christus, continued working on wood panels. Gradually, however, artists adopted canvas, which offered two great advantages. For one thing, the changing styles favored larger and larger paintings. Whereas wood panels were heavy and liable to crack, the lighter linen canvas could be stretched to an almost unlimited size. Second, as artists came to serve distant patrons, their canvases could be rolled up for easy and safe shipment. Canvas was prepared by stretching it over a wooden frame, sizing it with glue to seal the fibers and protect them from the corrosive action of oil paint, and then coating it with a white oil-based ground. Some painters then applied a thin layer of color over the ground, most often a warm brown or cool pale gray. Unlike tempera, oil paint dries very slowly, allowing artists far more time to manipulate the paint. Colors can be laid down next to each other and blended softly and seamlessly. They can be painted wet on wet with a new color painted into a color not yet dry. They can be scraped away partially or altogether for revision or effects. Again, unlike tempera, oil paint can be applied in a range of consistencies, from very thick to very thin. Petrus Christus, for example, did much of his painting in glazes. thin veils of translucent color like stained glass applied over a layer of opaque paint. Painting, as practiced by artists such as Christus, is a slow and time-consuming affair. The composition is generally worked out in advance down to the least detail, drawn on the ground, and then built up methodically with layer after layer of opaque paints and glazes. Artists who favor a less fussy, more spontaneous approach may work directly in opaque colors on the white ground, a technique sometimes called alla prima, Italian for at first. Also known as direct painting or wet on wet, alla prima implies that the painting was completed all at once, a single session, though in fact it may only look that way. Amy Silman's Nut takes advantage of oil paint's unique characteristics in a contemporary way. The surface has been worked and reworked, with colors brushed on, brushed over, scraped away, and reapplied, now in a thin translucent layer. The long green form, now in thick opaque strokes, the lavender Y form. Underlayers are allowed, even encouraged, to show through traces of the painting's development. It's impossible to say what memories or experiences triggered Nut, but the painting evolved in a way that allows us to distinguish, perhaps, two legs, a dangling arm, and a hand poised over the hem of a woman's coat drawn in an underlayer. Diagrammatic lines in white, green, and violet form a sort of scaffolding. Watercolor, gouache, and similar media. Watercolor consists of pigment in a vehicle of water and gum arabic, a sticky plant substance that acts as the binder. As with drawing, the most common support for watercolor is paper. Also, like drawing, watercolor is commonly thought of as an intimate art, small in scale and free in execution. Eclipsed for several centuries by the prestige of oil paints, watercolors were in fact often used for small and intimate works. Easy to carry and requiring only a glass of water for use, they could readily be taken on sketching expedition outdoors and were a favorite medium for amateur artists. The leading characteristic of watercolors is their transparency. They are not applied thickly like oil paints, but thinly in translucent washes. Although opaque white watercolor is available, this is reserved for special uses. More usually, the white paper serves for white, and dark areas are built up through several layers of transparent washes, which takes on depth without ever becoming completely opaque. John Singer Sargent's Mountain Stream is a perfect example of what we might think of as a classic watercolor technique, controlled and yet spontaneous in feeling. It gives the impression of having been dashed off in a single sitting. The white of the paper serves for the foam of the rushing stream, and even the shadows on the opposite shore retain a translucent quality. Gouache is watercolor with inert white pigment added. Inert pigment is pigment that becomes colorless or virtually colorless in paint. In gouache, it serves to make the colors opaque, which means that when used at full strength, they can completely hide any ground or other medium they are painted over. The poster paints given to children are basically gouache, although not of artist quality. Like watercolor, gouache can be applied in a translucent wash, although that is not its primary use. It dries quickly and uniformly and is especially well suited to large areas of flat, saturated color. The Cuban painter Wilfredo Lam exploits both the transparent and the opaque possibilities of gouache in The Jungle. Human and animal forms mingle in this fascinating work, which contains references to Santeria, a Caribbean religion that combines Santeria, a Caribbean religion that combines West African and Roman Catholic beliefs. Many cultures have developed paints that are similar to watercolor and gouache. Traditional Chinese artists, for example, paint with black ink made by mixing oil soot with animal glue. The resulting doughy paste is kneaded, then pressed into a mold and allowed to harden into a cinder block known as an ink stick. A painter or scribe, since the same ink is used for writing, prepares a session's supply of ink by grinding the stick with water on an ink stone, a fine-grained stone applied to offer a smooth grinding surface, and a well for water. Traditional colors are made in the same way, with powdered pigments ground in water and bound with animal glue. Some pigments yield transparent tones that resemble watercolor. Others produce opaque colors that more closely resemble gouache. The earliest known ink sticks date from the period in Chinese history known as the Warring States. Ink sticks are still manufactured today, making them perhaps the oldest paint medium in continuous use. Chang Dai Qian used ink and colors to paint mountains clearing after rain. In a display of virtuosity, Chang floated his pigments onto the paper in billowing amorphous shapes that transformed the results into a recognizable landscape by adding a cluster of houses and a boat and some branches with a few deft strokes. The result is like a magic trick we could watch again and again. Traditional artists in India and the Islamic world also use ink and colors. Ink is made with soot and animal glue as in China. Paints are made by grinding pigments in water with a binder of animal glue or gum arabic according to local preference. Painters in these traditions generally favor opaque, gouache-like colors for their work. As you can see, if you look back at such paintings as Jahangir Reeves's A Cup from Khusrau and Maharana Amar Singh II, Prince Sangram Singh and courtiers watch the performance of an acrobat and musicians. Acrylic. The enormous developments in chemistry during the 20th century had an impact on artist studios. By the 1930s, chemists had learned to make strong, weatherproof industrial paints using a vehicle of synthetic plastic resin. Artists began to experiment with these paints almost immediately. By the 1950s, chemists had made many advances in the new technology and also adapted it to artist requirements for permanence. For the first time since it was developed, oil paint had a challenger as the principal medium for Western painting. These now synthetic artist colors are broadly known as acrylics, although a more exact name for them is polymer paints. The vehicle consists of acrylic resin polymerized, which means it's simple molecules linked into long chains, through emulsion in water. As acrylic paint dries, the resin particles coalesce to form tough, flexible, and waterproof film. Depending on how they are used, acrylic can mimic the effects of oil paint, watercolor, gouache, and even tempera. They can be used on prepared or raw canvas, and also on paper and fabric. They can be layered into a heavy impasto like oils, or diluted with water and spread in translucent washes like watercolor. Like tempera, they dry quickly and permanently. Artists using acrylics usually rest their brushes in water while working, for if the paint dries on the brush, it is extremely difficult to remove. Brazilian painter Beatriz Milhães developed an unusual technique for working with acrylics. To create a painting such as Mariposa, Milhães first paints each motif separately on a sheet of clear plastic. When the paint has dried, she glues the motif face down onto the canvas and peels away the plastic backing, revealing the motif's smooth underside, motif by motif, element by element. Milhães builds up her painting as though she were making a collage. The technique demands that the artist plan ahead, for each motif must be painted in reverse, both in the way its colors are layered, since it is the underside that will show, and its orientation, since attaching it face down, will reverse right to left. Painting and beyond, off the wall. Most of the paintings we have looked at in this chapter are easel paintings, a term for paintings executed on an easel or similar support. An easel is a portable stand that props a painting in progress up vertically so that the artist can work facing it in the position that a viewer will eventually take. The painting that Diego Velázquez depicts himself working on in Les Meninas is propped up against an easel, for example, see 1711. Unlike frescoes or murals, easel paintings are portable objects generally rectangular in format that can be hung on any wall big enough to accommodate them. Easel painting came into prominence during the Renaissance and has dominated the Western painting tradition ever since. Chances are that if you were asked to imagine a painting, it is an easel painting that would come to mind. Modern artists seeking new means of expression and having new things to express have pushed the boundaries of easel painting, imagining other ways for painting to be made and experienced. In the 1940s, for example, Jackson Pollock did away with the easel and spread his canvas on the floor so that he could spatter and drip paint onto it from above. A few years later, Pollock's younger colleague, Holland Frankenthaler, followed his lead, placing raw, unprimed canvas on the floor and flooding it with thinned paint that soaked into the fabric like dye. During the 1960s, Linda Bengalis took their ideas a step further, pouring her colors directly onto the floor and leaving them there. Working with large cans of latex into which she had stirred pigments, Bengalis poured overlapping flows of vivid color onto the floor, creating works she called fallen paintings. Many of her fallen paintings, like the one she is shown working on in the illustration here, were site-specific and temporary, created in an exhibition space and then discarded when the exhibition was over. Others were created in their studio and detached from the floor, making them portable and permanent. When Bengalis painting not only left the wall but also broke free of traditional geometric formats, for the shape of the fallen paintings were determined by the flow of the latex. Bengalis' fallen paintings have a sculptural presence, like a very low relief, and they share the viewer's space in a way that sculpture does. A number of artists have since worked in the space that Bengalis and others opened up between painting, sculpture, and installation. One is the Berlin-based artist Katharina Gross, whose exuberant spray-painted colors run riot over the walls, windows, fiberglass sculptures, fabricated boulders, articles of clothing, and piles of earth. And one floor up more highly, elongated blocks of white styrofoam established a visual link with the white walls of the space. The artist has compared them to crystallized light, like sunlight, so blinding that it blocks our view for a moment. Unavoidably, the illustration here gathers the work into traditional rectangular view of an easel painting, as though reclaiming it for the territory it has escaped from. Photography does this to our lived experience all the time, whether we notice it or not. In fact, the artist does not intend the work to be a composition in the traditional sense at all. It is not meant to appear unified from a certain point of view outside the artwork. It is meant to be experienced from inside, moment by moment. We put it together as we move, every second anew, says Gross. We continually remake this surrounding, just as we do when we perceive the world. To see the installation as a coherent unit is an illusion. The idea of painting without paint. What makes a work of art a painting? The most obvious answer would seem to be paint, but a number of artists today are challenging that assumption. They make works that have the scale and force of paintings, that are clearly informed by the history and tradition of painting, and yet that do not use paint as a medium. Mark Bradford makes paintings from posters and billboard paper he finds in his neighborhood and on his travels. He soaks thick, layered accumulations of advertisements in water until their glue softens and the layers separate. From this weathered, scavenged material, he builds up a layered surface on a canvas support, often incorporating other elements such as twine, caulking, and black carbon paper. Then he goes to work with a power sander, excavating the layers, erasing and revealing. He may use bleach to eat away the colors, or paste still more paper over the distressed surface and work it over in turns. One result of this process is the monumental Black Venus. Black Venus reflects Bradford's lifelong interest in imaginary maps. It was inspired by an upscale neighborhood in Los Angeles that is home to many affluent African Americans. Bradford began the piece by printing online maps of specific addresses in the neighborhood and making drawings from them. From the drawings, he cut up paper and glued it down. But somewhere along the line, the map and the actual address collapsed into imagination. Bradford relates, and that's where Black Venus came from. I'm always removing myself from the first thing, the first impulse. Bradford calls his work paintings, he says, because they are made on a stretched canvas support, just as oil paintings are. Some people describe them as collage, but I feel like I'm a traditional painter, he says. I just don't use paint, but I do set up my studio in a very formal and kind of traditional way. And I use the logic of paint. I use the concepts of painting. Another artist who makes paintings without paint is Channing Hansen. Hansen's knit paintings using yarn. Hansen knits paintings using yarn that he spins by hand and dyes himself. Hansen has been making sculpture and performance for many years when he took up knitting to keep his hands busy while he was away from the studio. The more he knit, the more he saw it as a potential as a medium for art. Wanting to thoroughly understand his materials, Hansen learned how to spin. He is a proud member of the Greater Los Angeles Spinners Guild. He has even participated in a sheep shearing to understand how wool is harvested. I like to go to the very root of something, he says simply. Spinning and dyeing yarn link Hansen to such age-old technologies as weaving and pottery. But what he subsequently does with the yarn is inspired by contemporary science, computer code, and the heritage of Fluxus, an avant-garde movement that disseminated lists of instructions to serve as scores for events and performances. Practical knitting, the kind that produces a sweater or a cap, proceeds according to a pattern which consists of row-by-row instructions that specify how many stitches to begin with, when to increase or decrease their number, what type of knitting stitch to use and for how long, when to change colors, and so on. Hansen also knits according to instruction, but his instructions are generated by a computer algorithm, a self-described armchair physicist. Hansen is fascinated by such concerns of contemporary physics as higher dimensional spaces and quantum mechanics. The code he wrote using a random number generator that exploits a quantum optics process to pick from a list of instructions he gives it. The results direct every aspect of the knitting, including colors, fiber types, patterns, textures, and their interplay. The algorithm takes my subjectivity out of the equation and tells me what to do, including the mistakes, he explains. When the knitting is completed, Hansen stretches the finished textile over the same type of rectangular wooden chassis that canvas is stretched on for traditional paintings. Often, as in algo, the support shows through the work to become part of the image. Hansen's code mutates and expands with each piece he makes. Algo 54 was named for its 54th iteration. Sumptuous images, Mosaic, and tapestry. When painting rose to prominence during the Renaissance, it found itself in the company of two other highly esteemed techniques for creating monumental two-dimensional images, mosaic, and tapestry. Painters were often called upon to create designs for these media, which were then carried out by a specialized workshop. Mosaic is made of small, closely spread particles called tesserae, singular tessera, embedded in a binder such as mortar or cement. Tesserae function similarly to the dots in pointillist painting. Each one contributes a small patch of pure color to the construction of an image, which comes into focus at a certain distance. Like fresco, mosaic is well suited for decorating architectural surfaces such as walls and ceilings. Unlike fresco, however, mosaic is sturdy enough to stand up to the elements, and so it can be used for the floors and outdoor surfaces as well. The ancient Greek made floor mosaics using small pebbles as tesserae. Later, the practice arose of fabricating tesserae from natural materials such as colored marble or manufactured materials such as glass. The ancient Romans adopted the technique of mosaic along with other aspects of Greek artistic culture, using it not only for floors but also for walls and ceilings. After Christianity came to power within the Roman Empire, mosaic was used to decorate churches and other Christian religious buildings. The mausoleum Gala Placidia contains some of the most beautiful of these early Christian mosaics to have come down to us. Gala Placidia was a Roman empress and patron of the arts who lived among the first half of the 5th century. Her name has long been associated with this small mausoleum. And although scholars no longer believe that she was buried in it, she may well have sponsored its construction. The entire upper portion of the interior is covered with mosaics made of glass tesserae. In the detail illustrated here, two apostles standing to either side of an alabaster window panel raise their hands in greeting. In the smaller scene below, we see an open cabinet containing the 4 books of the Gospels, a gridiron set over a roaring fire, and a man carrying a cross over his right shoulder and holding an open book in his left hand. The man has long been identified as St. Lawrence, who was martyred by being roasted alive on a gridiron, though he may instead represent St. Vincent of Saragossa, also tortured on a gridiron, who was martyred after refusing to consign the gospel to the flames. In the 15th century, Renaissance painter Domenico Ghirlandaio spoke of mosaics as painting for eternity. Although their brilliant colors and glittering surfaces may not actually last forever, mosaics are far more durable than paintings, and that is part of their appeal. Ghirlandaio himself designed several mosaics, as did a number of Renaissance artists, including Raphael. Nevertheless, mosaic was largely abandoned in favor of fresco, which was faster, far less costly, and better suited to the Renaissance interest in naturalism. Interest in mosaic revived in the 19th century, and a number of important workshops were established. Rich with historical associations, mosaic has since reclaimed a place in artistic practice. A recent example is Nancy Sparrow's Artemis, acrobats, divas, and dancers. The whole work consists of 48 panels of glass mosaic set into tile walls of a New York City subway station. The station serves Lincoln Center, home to many performing arts organizations. A small repertoire of figures, ancient Egyptian musicians, arching acrobats, dancers ancient and modern. The ancient Greek goddess Artemis, and a glamorously robed diva, female opera singer, appeared again and again in various combinations across the panels, as though taking part in a theatrical performance or a ritual. The diva illustrated here was a new image for Sparrow, but many of the other figures had appeared often in her paintings over the years, reflecting her ongoing themes and concerns. Tapestry refers to a particular weaving technique and also to the wall hangings made using it. Weaving involves interlacing 2 sets of threads at right angles to each other. One set of threads, called the warp, is held taut. usually by a loom. The second, called the weft, is passed through the warp threads, winding over and under them in a set pattern. In ordinary cloth weaving, the weft thread passes back and forth from one edge of the warp to the other, eventually evenly building up a textile. In tapestry weaving, weft threads do not cross the entire warp, but rather are woven in locally to build up zones of color. You can imagine the warp of a tapestry as a blank canvas stretched out on the loom. The warp threads are not dyed. The weft threads are the weaver's palette of colors. Tapestry weave has been used in cultures to create textiles such as rugs or garments. In Europe, it was also used to create monumental pictorial wall hangings. Tapestry production began in Europe during the Middle Ages. The earliest surviving examples date from the 11th century. The hangings were commonly woven in sets that illustrated a theme or depicted episodes from a famous story. Starting during the Renaissance, prominent painters were commissioned to design tapestries. As with frescoes, designs for tapestries were produced as cartoons, full-scale painted drawings on paper. The cartoons were sent to weaving workshops to be translated into tapestry. The Battle of the Granicus, designed by the painter Charles Le Brun for the French king Louis XIV, shows how closely tapestry and paintings became intertwined. The Battle of the Granicus began as a painting, one of 5 monumental canvases narrating the life of the ancient Macedonian conqueror Alexander the Great. The king had commissioned the paintings from Le Brun, and he was so taken with them that he ordered that they be produced as tapestries. Le Brun prepared 2 sets of cartoons for 2 different tapestry workshops, and he fleshed out the 5 monumental scenes with 6 smaller ones. 8 sets of the tapestries were woven in all. 1 set was installed in the room in the royal residence. The others were saved for ceremonial display or given by the king as diplomatic gifts. Over 27 feet long and almost 16 feet in height, the Battle of the Granicus reproduces a slightly cropped and lightly reworked version of Le Brun's original painting. Massed in a dramatic diagonal, Alexander's men surge up from the river Granicus and into battle against the forces of Persia. Alexander himself is depicted at the center, wearing a magnificent plumed helmet, a sword in his outstretched right hand, his face a mask of fury. The turbulent scene is set in a woven frame flanked by borders that depict architectural ornaments, sculpted busts, garlands, shields, weapons, and the royal emblem and motto. In other words, the tapestry does not merely depict the scene itself, but also suggests a framed painting of the scene hung in a rich architectural setting. The passing of the aristocratic world that prized and commissioned tapestries coincided with the modern formation of art in which painting and sculpture took pride of place. Tapestry was now spoken of as a decorative art or a craft. We discuss these categories further in chapter 12. The tapestry workshops were still a focus of national pride, however, and artists continued to work with them. In fact, the principles of simultaneous contrast and optical blending discussed in chapter 4 were first articulated by the director of a tapestry workshop interested in the effects of juxtaposing differently colored threads. During the 20th century, tapestry gave rise to the new medium of fiber art, as more and more artists grew interested in weaving. For more about fiber art, see chapters 12 and 22. Today, when our definition of art has expanded to embrace a broad variety of media and techniques, a number of artists have again turned to realizing their ideas as tapestries. One such artist, Pei White, who has exhibited tapestries depicting such unlikely subjects as a crumpled aluminum and lazily curling smoke. Instead of a cartoon, White begins with a digital photograph. Working closely with a tapestry workshop in Belgium, she creates on the color palette and weaving patterns that will best give the image material form. A digital file of weaving instructions is prepared, and the tapestry is woven from them on a computer-driven loom. 40 feet long, still untitled, reprises the scale of the monumental tapestries of the past, inviting us to draw comparisons between then and now. Gone are the complex historical, mythological, and allegorical subjects that are intrigued and flattered aristocratic patrons such as Louis XIV. Those aren't for us. In our time and place, we content ourselves with humbler fare, the everyday beauty of a plume of smoke, frozen by photography so that we can take in every detail. An intriguing aspect of tapestry is that the image is not on the material the way paint is on canvas, but rather embedded in the material, part of its essence. White has described her smoke tapestries as cotton's dream of becoming something else, a dense, textured, weighty textile dreaming about being as insubstantial and fleeting as a wisp of smoke. And that is the end of chapter 7. And that, my friends, right there is a photograph that looks like a photograph of smoke, but is in fact a cotton and polyester tapestry. Very fascinating. So I've been reading these things and try not to go for too long, but I do want to just point out how some of what I just read is extremely interesting, simply because if you didn't read the text, you wouldn't know that that was a tapestry. And if you hadn't understood tapestry, you probably wouldn't appreciate how amazing turning that photograph of a wisp of smoke into a work of art that size really is. And there were a couple of other things in here that were really surprising to me. Like, for example, that being the result of computer algorithms based on like quantum physics or something. And there was some other things here that I liked. How there are two people reflected in this mirror that are apparently outside the shop. Wonderful stuff. Be sure and read the little sidebars that are in here, because there's questions on the quiz for that. Also, I do want to encourage you, as you listen to these that I do, to look at the pictures in your book if you can as I read. Anyway, that was chapter 7. Stay tuned for chapter 8. Thanks for listening.